My name is John Weingart, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to a program celebrating the publication of Standing on Principle, Lessons Learned in Public Life by James J. Florio. The official book release is not for another 2 weeks, but because you are here, if you haven't already purchased a copy of the book, you can get an advance copy to take home with you, and Governor Florio will sign it as long as his hand is willing right after the conversation. I want to recognize a number of people who are here today. There are a lot of people here who are now, or certainly once were, very important in New Jersey public life. So I'm not going to recognize them all, but I do want to recognize Governor McGreevey, who's right here. The Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Deborah Porritz. And Senator Bill Bradley. This program is presented by the Eagleton Center on the American Governor, which is part of the Eagleton Institute of Politics. The center seeks to promote research and discussion on the varied roles, powers, and legacies of governors in the 50 states in order to inform present and future state executive leadership and enhance historical knowledge and perspective. Our first focus has been on New Jersey, and in particular on the governors who served the state from 1974 through 2001. We have created extensive archives on former governors Brendan Byrne, Tom Kean, Christine Todd Whitman, and Jim Florio. If you visit our website, which is governors.rutgers.edu, you'll find videotaped retrospective interviews, biographical materials, photographs, memoranda, speeches, television ads, and much more. The latest addition to the Center on the American Governor website include a quick look at the gubernatorial races that are underway this year in a total of 36 states, a report the Center released last summer on gubernatorial transitions entitled From Candidate to Governor-Elect, and a new appreciation of a report issued 50 years ago by a commission formed by then-Governor Richard Hughes with former governors Robert Minor and Alfred Driscoll among its members in the wake of the 1967 civil disorders in Newark and several other New Jersey cities. Today we are gathered for a conversation between Jim Florio and Steve Kornacki. Despite the fact that neither of them needs an introduction, I will take a moment to introduce them both. Steve Kornacki is well known as a national political correspondent at MSNBC. Although he is from Massachusetts, his start in political journalism was here in New Jersey, writing for politicsnj.com. And I know that many of those gathered in this room think of him as the local guy who made good and take great pride in his success. Steve's forthcoming book, called The Red and the Blue, the 1990s and the Birth of Tribalism, is scheduled for publication in October, so maybe we'll all gather here again. When I invited Steve to participate in this evening's program, he immediately said yes, asking only that we get him an advance copy of Governor Florio's book so he could read it first, and that we understand that he would need to rush out at the end of this conversation to cover today's special election in Arizona. Jim Florio was a state assembly representative, a member of the U.S. House of Representatives, and New Jersey's 49th governor. For many years, he was also a professor of public policy and administration at the Blaustein School here at Rutgers. Currently, he is a practicing attorney and remains an active and influential voice in New Jersey public life, public policy, and civic life. His new book, Standing on Principle, Lessons Learned in Public Life, is the story, reflections, and visions of one man. But transposing it from concept to the volume now on sale this evening required assistance from others. At the governor's request, I want to quickly express his thanks to some of those people. First, the steering committee that spearheaded the drive for the necessary financial support, composed of Brenda Bacon, Angela Genova, Karen Kessler, Harry Pazicki, Rick Wright, and George Zoffinger. Second, to everyone, including many of you here tonight, who responded generously to the steering committee's request for support of this project. Third, Rutgers University Press. Fourth, the invaluable research and writing assistance provided by Fred Hillman, Rona Parker, and Rick Sinding. And fifth, the many others who are described in the acknowledgement sections of the book. Now, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming to the stage Governor Jim Florio and Steve Kornacki.
All right, well, make sure this is on. John, thank you for that welcome, and thank everybody for turning out tonight. This is a great crowd we have here. A lot of familiar faces to me, probably many more to the governor here. And yes, I have been looking forward to this since I was asked, and I read your book with great interest. And I think we're going to try to get through as much as we can just between myself and the governor here, and then open it up to you folks in the audience, probably after about half an hour, 40 minutes or so, and just open season on the governor at that point. So, with that warning, Governor, I'll start with this. Just it's been about 25 years. It's been exactly 25 years since the end of your term as governor. You are writing a book about your term in office, about your political life. What prompted you in the year 2018 to write this book?
Well, first of all, let me say how impressed I am. My whole life is represented by many people in the audience, so I'm impressed that you'd come out and be part of this. Well, what really prompted me was people have mentioned over the years that I ought to give some thought to writing a book. And I've been very busy doing a whole lot of things. But finally, I was persuaded by Fred Hillman and Rona Parker, who talked to me about doing it. Because I was explaining to them, it's a good idea, but I'm very busy. I'm earning a living. I'm trying to do things. And they explained to me how it could be done a little more efficiently, that I would do interviews with them, and that I would do tapings, and they would transcribe, and we'd be able to do it fairly intensively, but with a minimum amount of effort. Turned out to be much more effort than I thought, but it was pleasurable. And they were able to get me to think through some things in ways that I hadn't thought about. And I was inspired, in one respect, by the experience I had when I taught at law school in Camden at Rutgers. I taught administrative law. Administrative law was something I really didn't understand until I went to Washington. I understood that Congress thinks they make the laws, but it's really the administrative agencies that interpret the laws. So, for example, cleaning up toxic waste. Well, what is toxic waste? How clean is clean? That's made not by the Congress, that's made by the decisions made by the administrative agency, in this case, EPA. So I taught administrative law by using experiences that I had in Washington with the FTC and the ICC and EPA to be able to highlight real experiences and teaching the principles of administrative law. I thought that would be a good approach for this book. And so the book really is lessons learned as a result of real-life experiences that I had. And I think it's turned out reasonably well, and I think it's hopefully going to be something that's received and helpful to people, particularly decision makers. So that's really the motivation.
And I like that, and I think that's an interesting way to get into sort of the, we'll start where you start in the book, because you start at sort of the heart of the action. Something I get the sense is, and you can tell me if this is true, I think what you consider one of your proudest moments in public service, but it's something that's relevant to today as well, and that was the issue of gun control, the issue of gun violence, and the assault weapons ban that, when you were governor, was put on the books here in New Jersey, and the climate, just reading your account of it and going back and taking a little bit of a look at that era, the late 80s, the early 90s. You had a school shooting in California you write about that got the nation's attention. The violent crime rate was soaring. You take office as governor of New Jersey. You've got a somewhat friendly legislature at that point, and you decide this is something you want to take on. Can you compare what it took for you as governor to get the assault weapons ban through in this state in 1990 compared to the political climate and the political challenges that would confront somebody making that decision today?
Well, it's really interesting. I put this as the first chapter in the book because it highlights one of the basic themes of the whole book, which is that public policy is made in an acceptable way and a good way for the public interest when citizens, average citizens, become engaged and they become informed about the issue. That one of the other sub-themes is that government is not inherently good or bad. It's a tool. It's a tool when used by people of good faith that can achieve the public interest. And the assault weapon ban controversy was a wonderful example of that. Because when people started out, when I started the process, people said, it's impossible. The NRA and the gun lobby, just too powerful, you can't overcome them. Well, we persuaded the legislature to take it on and to ban assault weapons. The reference was made to the school shooting that took place in 1989. Now, we all know that's not ended. It's happened and continues to the very time that we're in now. And I guess what we did was get the legislature to get it through. It was the Democratic legislature, a supportive legislature, and they passed a ban. That was not a source of good news for the NRA. They came to New Jersey and said, we're going to get rid of all of you people and we're going to repeal the bill. They were successful. They had a legislature that was a pro-gun legislature elected. And they were successful in getting the bill to repeal the ban passed through both houses of the legislature. I vetoed the ban. So the issue became whether the legislature, there was a pro-gun legislature, could override the veto. We took on a campaign, that is people in my administration and supporters around the state, took on a campaign that was an intensive campaign that mobilized educators, talk about the impact of gun violence on students. We brought in medical people. We had a doctor from Newark who testified that the Department of Defense brought their military surgeons to Newark, New Jersey to learn how to deal with gun violence. We had law enforcement officials. The prosecutor from Camden County testified that he would not allow the law enforcement officials to go to North Camden, a tough neighborhood, because there was more firepower on the bad guy's side than there was on the good guy's side. We had ministers come in and testify how this was a moral issue. We had op-eds, we had events taking place. And to make a long story short, in the space of about a month and a half, we turned the whole process around so that in the final vote in the Senate, not one single senator, Democrat or Republican, was willing to override my veto. It was really, in some respects, in my opinion, New Jersey's finest hour, because it highlighted the fact that when real people, real citizens, become engaged, it doesn't make any difference how powerful the special interest is. It doesn't make any difference how much money, how much organizing skill they had. People can overwhelm that sort of power. It was a very inspiring thing for me, and I was very pleased when the people at the John F. Kennedy Commission, Library Commission, gave me an award for the effort on the assault weapon ban.
It was the Profile and Courage Award that you won for that.
And the good thing that illustrates the principle that there's no permanent winners or losers in politics is what's happening now. Because what's happened now is that people have mobilized, things have changed, people have become more informed and more engaged, and I think we're on the verge of a major process change in New Jersey on the whole question of military assault weapons and gun violence and in general. Because the fact of the matter is that the epidemic of gun violence is now on the verge of being addressed in a sensible way.
Let me ask you too, there's the question of within New Jersey and there's a question nationally, because just listening to you describe the politics of the issue in the early 90s and how you approached it then, I'm hearing a lot of overlap with what we're talking about and seeing right now, the march on Washington and elsewhere, the NRA fighting it tooth and nail. Those forces, the forces in opposition, the NRA, grassroots gun owners, do you think they are stronger politically now than they were then? Or do you think that the forces on the other side are stronger now?
I think they're as strong as they ever were, but the forces on the other side. For example, the new governor, the governor's campaign, the new governor campaigned, Governor Murphy, on the basis of fact that he was going to address this issue. How many political people have you known who would campaign on saying they're going to put restrictions on the gun lobby? No one that I know has ever campaigned on that issue. He did, and he is in the process of doing it. That's telling me things are changing for the good.
Let me ask you, you mentioned there too, a big change that happened in New Jersey politics while you were governor, and we'll get to the story behind that, but the legislature went from Democratic to Republican in the middle of your term in 1991. One of the issues I think that people remember from that time is the issue of taxes. And in the book, you wrote something, and I ask you maybe to elaborate on this, that struck me, that when you came to office at the start of 1990, and you had just won in 1989, a pretty easy election, it was about 25 points, I think, over Jim Courter. So you came in with a pretty big head of steam there, and you were looking at a budget shortfall that was bigger than you were expecting. You were looking at a pending decision from the state Supreme Court that was going to upend the school funding formula, probably require more money, a change in how money was spent. And you basically looked at it and you said, I can raise taxes, I can raise the income tax, I can raise the sales tax, and we can come up with a long-term solution to this. Or the other option you were given was sort of a patch job that in the moment, in 1990 and 91, would probably be more politically palatable for you and for your entire party. And what you said in the book was you thought about it and you had spent years politically getting yourself in position to where you were, the governor of New Jersey, no longer an assemblyman, a congressman, a candidate. You're the governor, and you're not going to put all that work in if you're going to make the short-term decision now.
If you have political credits that you build up, use them. And the fact of the matter is that I had a lot of advice, good faith advice that we should, delay. And for example, on the school issue, the Supreme Court came down with a decision saying that we had to finance state participation in the school thing. And people said, well, do what previously people have done in this situation. Just don't do anything. And then ultimately you'll deal with it in some way. Someone will force you to do it. When the Supreme Court, last time it got dealt with, the Supreme Court threatened to close the schools. That forced the issue. And that might have made more political sense, but the fact of the matter is, I felt very badly about the prospect of delaying for another year or two that these students would be going to schools that were not as good as they could be. And so we went forward and did it. And that was the right thing to do. But the fact of the matter is, there's always easy things to not do. Not making a decision is a decision. And in some respects, when the pain of not working exceeds the pain of doing something, then things will get done. And in this instance, I felt, and the people who were supporting me felt that it was time to do something.
Were you ready for, probably folks don't need a reminder, but just to set the scene for anyone who does, in the wake of signing that tax increase, there were rallies in Trenton. The radio station that everybody now knows, 101.5, this was sort of the grist for its early days, the opposition to this. This group, Hands Across New Jersey, started as a grassroots backlash. This was a tax revolt. Were you ready for that when you signed it? Did you think something like that would happen?
Nobody was ready for it, least of all me. But the fact of the matter is, it was something that was interesting. I'll just share with you an interesting story about the quality and the character of some of the opponents. Hands Across New Jersey, as you may remember, was a very interesting group of people. Brenda Bacon, who was here, and I sat and listened to the people we invited in. We invited them in off the street, said, please bring your leaders to the organization, to my office. They came in, we sat and we talked, and I said, well, tell me what your concerns are. And they told me that this was outrageous, we were doing all these things. I said, well, first of all, how many people paid the new income tax? And they didn't say that. I said, well, anybody who made more than $70,000, I think it was $70,000, is not going to pay anything. Anybody who made less than $70,000 would not pay anything. I said, anybody who made $70,000, they all laughed and said, no, none of us said that. said, how many of you are getting an increased homestead rebate? They all raised their hand. How many people are now having $400 reduced off of their insurance business as a result of us getting rid of the JUA, the Underwriting Association? They all raised their hand. I said, why the hell are you here? You are the folks that are benefiting from this. And one fellow said, well, I'm planning on being a millionaire someday, and I don't like the idea of taxation on my millions of dollars when I get them. I bit my tongue a lot, but that was sort of the quality of what we were dealing with. It was tough. But I also remember, and now I would remind everybody, that I was the last governor who fully funded the state pension fund. After us, nobody did. I mean, and to this day, it's not fully pensioned. And the estimates are anywhere from 60 billion to 120 billion, depending upon your accounting system, as to what the default is.
I was wondering, I'll ask, not sure how to ask this question, but I'm reading the book, what you're just mentioning now. Did it and does it bother you? Is there a part of you that says, all right, I think I made the right decision on taxes, and I was willing to take the political bullet, lose re-election in 1993, but I thought I had solved something long term. And to then watch what you just said about, a successor coming in and undoing a lot of that tax legacy and paying for it that way. Do you look back and say, I took the political bullet for nothing?
No, I don't do that. I mean, thinking long term is something I've sort of incorporated into my whole way of thinking. And I think that's really one of the problems in our society, not just politically, but in the business community as well. I mean, thinking about the short-term, easy answer is carrying out things in a way that's not compatible with the public interest. Thinking long-term. And it's not that hard. I mean, I've often said on a couple of occasions that if I had a stadium with 7 million people or 8 million people in it and could explain things, the vast majority of right-thinking people would say, well, yeah, that's right. I mean, that makes sense. We don't like the gas tax, but we like the idea of a bridge falling down with me riding over it, much less. And most of these things can be explained if you take the time to listen. That's why getting citizens engaged and informed is the essence of getting good things done. Some political people are too lazy to take on that task, and so they just yes people to that. That's the problem that we have in our society. It's hard work to go out and govern oneself, but it's absolutely essential for the orderly implementation of democracy.
And listening to you describe those town hall meetings, trying to sell your tax plan and kind of hitting a dead, I'm thinking of that famous line the Tea Partier supposedly said, keep your government hands off my Medicare.
Well, equally as impressive was a town meeting I had down in Washington Township in Gloucester County, where I went in, the audience was fairly hostile when I started. I explained things, and I think for the most part, I was able to get most people to be okay. But at the end, one guy jumps up and says, you're the worst governor since Judas Iscariot. Since Pontius Pilate. I thanked him for his biblical reference. I figured he was beyond rehabilitation.
Is there a lesson from what you're describing about how a leader, a governor, an executive, can manage the kinds of populist currents you're describing? Is there, beyond laying out your best argument and being patient and biting your tongue, is there an emotional component? Is there a symbolic component? Is there a way to connect with that current and acknowledge it somehow without sacrificing your principle?
I think, and this goes to the whole polarization of the current political climate. Try to build lessons of compatibility. Find out, even in your worst enemy, there's something there that there's compatibility with you. Strive to touch that note, and then deal with other problems after that. People are, the bipartisanship that used to exist, for example, in Congress, I was very I think, successful in getting a lot of things done because of the idea of collegiality, civility, trying to grab a relationship and then building off of that. That's not really done as much as it should be nowadays. The polarization is antithetical to civility.
Well, I want to ask you a few questions here. We have a timekeeper. I want to make sure, are we still? I have some questions here. We've talked about your governorship. I want to talk about your political career a little bit and some of the themes you were starting to hit on there. Let me start with this, though, because I thought this was an interesting thing you mentioned a few times in the book. You chose a career in politics, running for office, being in front of people like this. You talk about being an introvert, about not necessarily being comfortable with the schmoozing aspect of politics. Did that hinder you? And what would ultimately draw you to politics, knowing that about yourself?
Well, I am not a great backslapper. I'm not, as I say, I'm not a great backslapper. That's not been my strong point. I guess my strong point has been self-discipline and overcoming the problems that I have with regard to socialization. I mean, it's interesting. One of the other themes in the book is that your values are shaped in many respects by your youth. You know, my parents were very interesting people. They've passed away now, but they were working class people. Neither of them graduated from high school, and I learned a lot from them. It's one of the reasons why Lucinda and I are on an advisory board for preschool education, because I believe early years are extremely important in framing your references, framing your value systems. My father was a rough-edge guy. He worked in the shipyards. He taught me to be industrious, to work very hard. He was a very hard worker. But he was also a gambler, I mean, literally a gambler. He worked at the shipyard in the Navy Yard in Brooklyn, and after the war closed, we lived on his poker winnings for many, many years. Actually, I have that trait. I'm a gambler, not money-wise. I'm frugal. But I'm willing to gamble on things that I feel strongly about, and I've done that. On the other hand, my mother was very reclusive. My mother was very quiet. She was a bookish person, and she taught me a lot of things, most of them good, some of them less than good. Good was be punctual. To be late is to be rude. Most of my staff people in the audience know all about that. She taught me to be, we're clean. We're poor, but we're clean, okay? Eat all the food on your table because there are poor people in Europe that don't have. But then on the other side of the ledger, she was very reclusive, as I said. She said, don't get too close to people. Watch your friends, some will turn on you. I never found out what the traumatic event was in her life that caused her to do that, but that's not advice that's enhancing one's political career.
Oh, I was going to ask, did that serve you well? And sounds like it might.
Self-discipline has allowed me to overcome some of the good advice that my mother gave to me. But the answer to your question is that it has not been an easy thing for me. I've had to work hard, but I've substituted, at least I've tried to substitute substance for appearance sake. And I've mastered some of the art, and I've not mastered other parts of the art. But I've always believed that most people are rational, even if it takes a long time to appreciate the rationality. And so I've really worked information-wise to give people the thought process. Many of the staff people remember the town meetings we went to, many of which were difficult. But the fact of the matter is, after a while, when you explain things, if you can convince people that you're sincere, that you're really trying to do the right thing, even if they disagree with you, they'll come around and say, I'll give you the benefit of the doubt. And that's really what I've really tried to do.
You mentioned, too, when you were elected governor in 1989, it was basically your first executive role since I think just out of college. You'd been a legislator. You'd been in Congress in the 70s and the 80s, and you'd been aiming your career towards becoming governor. But having gone through it all now, when you look back, do you think of yourself as a legislator or an executive?
A lot of people ask me that question about the contrast between the two and how I've interacted with it. And it's interesting, I've enjoyed both. I enjoyed the Congress from the vantage point of, in Congress, you get a lot done in a narrow area. The committee that you're on really determines the scope of your capability of getting things done. I happen to be on and a chairman of a committee that dealt with a lot of good topics. The word commerce was in the title. That led the parliamentarian to give us broad scope of authority over different areas because commerce is all-encompassing. But we had specific authority over environmental issues, transportation issues, some healthcare issues, things that I was interested in. And by virtue of being the chairman of the committee on those things that you're really interested in, you can have a real major impact in the nation on those topics that you cover. Being governor is different in the sense that you have a full scope of a lot of things, but you don't have the actual impact on details of things. You have to have a good staff, and I was fortunate always to have a good staff. And you have responsibility for everything, but not in detail. You don't get involved in the details, the staff does it. So I enjoy both because I enjoyed the scope of things, but I really wanted to get involved with the things that I cared strongly about, and I was able to do that.
I hear this from every former member of Congress. It seems they say it on their way out the door, and I'm curious if this was your experience too, if this is what you think, that Congress worked a lot better when you were there than it does today. Do you believe that, and can you identify the specific reasons for that, the changes that have made that happen?
Well, that's a whole night in itself, the changes that have occurred. But there have been changes that have taken place, again, in our society, not necessarily only in Congress. But the changes that have taken place have not been helpful to anyone, and collegiality and civility, the absence of those are the things that have caused problems. On a societal basis, the difficulties that we have are that what has occurred is that we have not dealt with the problem that every society has dealt with very well. It's the problem of the difference between people who are satisfied with the society or the government or the community and people who are not. That's a fact of life. There are always going to be those tensions that exist. This country traditionally has dealt with those tensions by saying to the people who are not satisfied that there is a concept of upward mobility. You can work your way into the people who are satisfied if you do it. People who are satisfied don't want to change too terribly much because they are satisfied. It's a wonderful book, by the way, if you read John Kenneth Galbraith, The Culture of Contentment, in which he talks about in the 50% election, 26% constitutes a majority, which means that 74% are not going to be satisfied because their policies are not being carried out. It's a very interesting thought. And so when you cut off upward mobility, the people who are not satisfied are going to be frustrated, they're going to be stressful, they're going to be alienated, they're going to be snapping out. The people who are satisfied will respond to that. And as much as they're satisfied, they've got the resources, they've got the power, they've got the communications capability of keeping people down. You can see that this festering and animosity results in the polarization that we currently have. So the answer, by the way, to the degree that there's a quick answer, is to make sure that we do not cut off the opportunities for people to advance. We do not have higher education so unaffordable that people can't have the opportunities. As you said, I'm a high school dropout. I've been able to get a good quality education. If I were not able to do that, I, by virtue of my aggressive inclinations, would be in the forefront of breaking up against the barriers that would stop us or stop me or people like me from moving up. I mean, I've always felt very passionately about unfairness. injustice to people. And if in fact someone is being treated unfairly because they don't let their skills advance themselves, they're going to be very unhappy. That situation is not acceptable, and we all have to start addressing that. So it's not up to the political people only, it's all of us to get the political people to be sensitive to those things.
You also write, and folks here will remember, after finishing up as governor, a few years later, you did make another political campaign. You ran for the United States Senate in 2000, and your opponent in the Democratic primary was John Corzine, and you write about this. John Corzine spent some amount of money there. I can't remember the exact amount, but he...
$37 million.
There it is. I thought he might know it.
There are certain numbers that stick in my mind. Like the 1981 campaign, 1,797.
The margin in 81. But let me ask you this. There are no, as we know, there are no term limits on members of Congress, on senators. If you'd been elected in 2000, that seat would be up right now in 2018. If you'd been elected, would you still be Senator Jim Florio today? Would you have liked that life long term, do you think?
I've been working as hard now as I ever have been. All my friends are retiring and I'm still working my tail off. Obviously, I've screwed up somewhere along the way. But I have energy, I think clearly, reasonably clearly, so I probably would be considering running, yes.
There you go. And we've, one more here before we go to the questions in the audience, because I know we're coming up on the time here, but this just occurred to me, I forgot to ask you, and I wanted to make sure to ask it. You wrote a few times in the book about your political rise and about the role of party machines, party bosses. And several times you said, in the 1970s, in the 1980s, they were more powerful than they are today. I think a lot of folks looking at New Jersey today, especially from the outside, I know because I have these conversations a lot, say, oh my God, it's like the 1950s still in New Jersey in terms of machine and boss culture. How would you describe the power of party machines and party bosses today versus when you started?
Well, it's changed quite a bit. I mean, when I first came onto the scene in the early 60s, the typical political campaign was still at its height. I mean, there were political machines that were really machines. I mean, some of my mentors subsequently went off to jail. I learned a lot from them, and I learned what to do and what not to do. But it's different now from then. But it's interesting. One of the things I've tried to cultivate over the years, which has put me in good stead, is always have a degree of independence from everything. They'll be totally dependent upon individuals or groups or organizations. And I've consciously done that sort of thing. The political machine that I came out of, I ultimately split from because of some of the problems they were having. And I built my own organization. I mean, I built an organization of environmentally sensitive people, people who are interested in law enforcement. I had in Camden City, where I was based, we had a large Polish-American community. I was associated with the Polish-American Club, giving free wills as a young man to citizens there, building a support group. So independence is very important for avoiding the types of problems that flow from being so totally dependent upon a political organization. The political organizations now are there. They're still fairly significant in the primary process. Right. But the vast majority of people, even people who are technically associated with the parties, think much more independently than they ever did. And that's probably on balance a good thing.
All right. Well, I had 2 pages of questions here. I don't think I got to all of them, but I think the folks in the audience do. So, we'll excellent. I was looking at the clock. I was getting all nervous. Well, in that case, let me see what else we can get here. Oh, I've got a good one. Okay. There was a great story in here. I like old political stories. You talked about your first run for governor in 1977, and Brendan Byrne, the late Brendan Byrne, was having some issues with popularity. His political standing was not good, and about 10 Democrats ran against him in the primary, and you were among those Democrats, and you talked about sort of agonizing over whether to run, whether he was okay with you running, and then finding out later that maybe you'd been used a little.
Well, it's interesting. It's an interesting story, and I've talked to Brendan, obviously he's passed away recently, but I've talked to him about this, and he verified it. And Dick Leone, who some of you may remember, was sort of a Governor Burns, not quite hatchet man, but he was very aggressive. He was very aggressive. And I hated Dick Leone. Dick Leone came to me. I was a freshman assemblyman, a young assemblyman, and I was very supportive of Governor Byrne when he got elected. And Dick Leone would come to me periodically and say, "We need your support on something." I said, "Fine." And he said, "We need your support on the bill that we're going to be introducing in a couple of weeks." I said, "Well, I'd like to read the bill." No, you don't read the bill. You're one of our guys, you support it. So we had difficulties in that respect. But when Governor Kane was going to run for re-election, Governor Byrne, rather, was going to run for re-election, as you indicated, there was speculation he would not run. He was called OTB, one-term Byrne. He was so unpopular. I mean, he was really, up until recently, he was the most unpopular governor. But there was speculation in the papers that he was not going to run. So I was a relatively young congressman, full of myself. So I thought, well, I'm going to go talk to him. I went to Marvin, spoke with him, and I said to him, "Governor, if you don't run, I'm giving some thought to running. So please let me know as soon as you make your mind up." And he said, "Fine." So I didn't hear anything. Time went by. So I went out and got petitions. Got enough people to sign the petitions, waited till about a week or so before the deadline, and I didn't hear from him. I called, no call back. So I said, I guess he's not running. So I filed the petitions. He ran. As you said, 9 or 10 people are running. And he won. And so I called him and said, "I'm going to support you," whatever. And then later on, I found out that from Dick Leone, who became a very good friend, by the way. And it's true, and I'll give you something else with Bill Bradley, if he's still here. He can relate to this as well. But Leone tells me ultimately, we consciously sucked you in to into the primary vote because we understood we couldn't win unless we had at least 9 or 10 people working. And you took care of 5 counties in South Jersey for us. Yeah. The story, the Dick Leone story, which is kind of interesting as well, is that, and this led to my break with the Camden County machine later on. When Bill Bradley decided to run, Dick Leone was the governor's candidate. Dick Leone was the candidate for most of the organizations in the state. The fellow who was in charge of Camden County, Angelo Ericetti, was the mayor, the senator, the political boss. And he was my mentor. He got me involved in the whole process. And he came to me and said, "We're supporting Dick Leone." I said, "I'm not supporting Dick Leone. I'm a congressman." And I said, "I'm not supporting him." He says, "Oh, yes, you're going to support him. The organization's supporting him." I said, "I'm not." He came back later on and said, "I'd like you to go meet with Dick Leone. He wants to make nice with you." I said, "Fine." I drive up to Forsgate from Camden in a snowstorm. I meet with Dick Leone. He's sitting there, and he says, "You have to support me." I said, "Well, I'm really not really inclined to because of our bad relationships." He said, "Don't give me that. Ericetti's supporting him. You have no choice. You're going to be supporting me." My ride back to Camden was very interesting as I fumed and figured out ways that I could screw him. The easiest decision was that I was not going to support him. I go to Ericetti and say, "I'm not supporting him." Ericetti says, "Well, then you're off the line." I said, "Fine. I'm going out and getting freeholder candidates because the law is that you don't get a political line unless you have freeholder candidates." I go and find freeholder candidates. I get a call from Ericetti, and he says, "I'm sending my man, Armand Paglione, who's one of his guys, to see you." Paglione comes to see me, and he says, "Well, if you're going to run freeholder candidates, we're not going to take you off the line. We're taking you off the line, but we're going to give you a line. But you can't run freeholder candidates. I say it's against the law. You have to have freeholder candidates. We're going to get a judge to give you an order saying you can get a freeholder. They get a judge to give me an order to say, I have a line with Bill Bradley and Jim Florio on nobody else in the column. That's what happens. So we run, and we win. We beat the whole organization line. Yeah. The next year, I have a falling out with Eric Ketty. I'll tell you the reasons if you want to hear why. And we decide this is now our organization with all the environmental people, the Polish-American people, everybody else that I put together to have an independent organization running and winning. Eric Ketty subsequently goes to jail, but that was something that we were able to do. So it's an interesting thing how the primary race started a whole bunch of things going on that resulted in the things that have happened.
And he went to prison. It's such we always use the term colorful character, but and he passed away only a couple years ago. If you saw the movie American Hustle, I probably don't need to tell anybody here, but the Jeremy Renner character, I think it was based on Angela Ricchetti. Was there ever a late in life reconciliation with him, or was there ever a postscript to that story?
Not really. I mean, I recounted to him, and the story was about him. And I said some nice things about him, because he was really a very smart guy. If he'd stayed on the right side, could have been something very big, because he was very analytical. The character in the movie was very accurate. Very good. But
charismatic,
very charismatic, very good. His problem was the problem many political people have. You read your own headlines. You listen to people who tell you what you want to hear, and he saturated himself with people that yesed him to death. After a while, he started to believe it, and he got wrapped up in the abscam problem and had a difficulty. But I said nice things about him. The one thing I said that he took offense to, that I said he had a really rough, somewhat thuggish manner about him, which might have been the word I shouldn't have used. So that precluded the reconciliation.
I could imagine it. I could imagine it would.
Not a wise word, but not an inaccurate word.
I'm jumping a little over, but I want to ask you too about, we talked about your governorship, but your re-election campaign in 1993, also a very close race. It was a race that ended with some controversy as well. It was Ed Rollins, the Republican consultant for Christie Whitman, claiming and then recanting that voters have been paid.
Recanting and then going to the grand jury, swearing under oath that he was a liar. Because what he had said about taking place on election day, he said it was true. Then later, before the grand jury, he said it was not true.
I swear, Your Honor, I was lying.
I'm a liar.
Only in Jersey, right? Yeah. But how do you? First of all, the thing I'd forgotten, and it's in your book, and I went back, and it's every time I look at it, for somebody whose approval rating had fallen in the middle of your term, you fell as low as 18% after the tax hike. You were winning pretty big in the polls in the fall of 1993. Right. Did you think, I'm going to pull this off?
Yeah, the answer is yes. I thought we were successful, and we had about a 10-point lead or something just a couple of days out. And then what happened was the proposal by Mrs. Whitman, Governor Whitman, to cut taxes. I discounted that. I said, how the hell are you going to do that? And I was reinforced by all of the newspapers, literally all of the newspapers came out and said, this is irresponsible. You can't cut taxes by that much and maintain a balanced budget, which of course you're required to do. Shame on me. I mean, I didn't foresee that would be viable. But I mean, I understand it now. With hindsight, you have somebody that raised taxes and someone that promises to cut taxes. It's an easy choice for a lot of people. But I was correct in one respect, that you couldn't do that, and you didn't do that. So the way the tax cut was paid for was not to pay into the pension fund, which we subsequently have to deal with. But it was interesting. I've become, by the way, friends with Governor Whitman. We do television programs together. Likewise, I've become very good friends with Tom Kean. So there's life after.
Yeah, that relationships between former governors. How does that? Is it just sort of like you're the only one in the world who could understand what I went through? Is that sort of the basis of it?
That and the political process of knowing that elections are not really the most rational part of life. I mean, particularly when there's little change, little difference between the candidates, you struggle to find differences. Sometimes you struggle and torture reality. I mean, in the book, I make reference to a couple of things I've done in campaigns that I'm a little embarrassed by. I mean, one with Jim Cotter. The campaign was a good campaign, fairly clean, but I got talked by a consultant into approving an ad which had Jim Cotter, which he was stretching the truth in a couple of areas, but I had him with a Pinocchio nose, which is particularly degrading to me, and I was really regretful of that.
That sounds very tame compared to what we see now.
That's true. That's true. Yeah. And actually, in the campaign with Tom Kean, we went down, we were in South Jersey, my territory, and he said something he mispronounced the name of a road. So when I got up, I pronounced it correctly. Everybody in the audience caught it, cheered that I knew what I was talking about, and he didn't, which again was a fairly cheap shot. But in debates, I have somehow aggressive inclinations to bring out the worst in me.
Might be the old boxer in you there.
I guess.
I'm thinking. I'd forgotten too, we mentioned Ed Rollins on the Republican side. Your consultant, the guy running your campaign in '93, was James Carville, who had just become famous running the Clinton campaign in '92. This was his next project. It was, in the context too, was Clinton had raised taxes in the summer of '93, and his poll numbers dropped. So he was going to go, and this was the story that, as he told me, was he was going to prove in New Jersey that you could do it and get away with it. What was he like as a?
Well, in '93, he had already become a celebrity. So he subsequently apologized to me that he didn't pay as much attention to the race as he should have. Well, because he was in Latin America, he was doing all these things around the world. But in the initial campaign in '89, he gave us some advice because he had just finished a successful campaign in Pennsylvania. And he talked about health care. And we talked about health care in the campaign. We talked about insurance. He was very big on that as well. So he was a good advisor, but the campaign in '89 was helped much more by Richard Nixon than it was by anybody else, because that was the Watergate year was in '74.
74, yeah, first election of the House, yeah.
But we got a lot of good things in '89. That Nixon's impeachment was the problem.
Yeah, '74 was the year you got elected. Here's my closing question though. Just besides the run in 2000, ever have any other thoughts of getting back into it in the last 25 years? Any moments in your life, hey, maybe I could make it work here?
I have no tolerance for much of what's taking place.
Yeah.
I mean, it's interesting because the things I got done in Congress were all exclusively done with Republican help. I mean, I have members that I had cultivated. The whole legislative process, by the way, which is the subject of one of the chapters, is extremely interesting, and I would like to get a whole lot of the congressmen to read what had took place. Because the way things are done in Washington, if you're going to get anything done, is by collaboration. You have to master the process of getting things done in the committee that you're in. And more importantly, in the subcommittee that is focus of attention. Because if you can get things done with some minimum degree of bipartisanship in the subcommittee, it makes things infinitely easier as you go through the committee process and then the floor process and then reconciliation between the two houses. On the other hand, if you have no collaboration whatsoever at the basic level, you're not going to have very much success. So it entails, for example, the chairman, me in this case, almost keeping a book on all the members. What is it that prompts the members to be receptive? You know, one person listens to environmentalists, one person listens to labor, business, one person listens to nobody and has no interest in merit. Somebody else is just out of loyalty. You read the book on everybody, and you put things together to put together the collaboration. That's the way the legislation process works. And if you don't talk to anybody, you'll never get anything done. So it's a fairly refined process that is really easily able to be managed if you know what you're doing.
All right, that is a good note to end my portion of this on, and I will turn it over to John Weingart now. We get some more questions here.
I think actually it's a good portion to end on, a good comment to end on. There's still food in the back, I think, and there's definitely still books in the back. Thank you, Steve.
All right.
Thank you, Governor Florio.
Thank you very much.
You want to say anything?